So, hello. Thank you for being here in a non-teaching week. So, I want to, everyone knows me, but this, I think some of you know Julian. This is Julian Manley. And Julian is a visiting lecturer here and a colleague from the University of Lancaster. No.
University of Central Lancashire. Better get that one right. The others are the neighbours and rivals.
It's a good thing that I didn't say more. So what we're going to present is a piece of work that I did in South Africa, and we've done a lot of social dreaming work together. And we'll sort of talk a little bit about our own sort of work and background as we go. But this is a collaboration that resulted in a chapter, actually, in these publications which are... Are you? What should I do? Speak up.
Yeah, or come closer to us.
Okay. So the work we're presenting was published in a chapter in a series of books, which Violent States and Creative States, which is a very worthwhile publication, really looking at the creative arts and interventions that sort of engage in social change, and psychotherapy. So we're going to begin and leave time for discussion and conversation. So really just to give a context of the work is the work happened in the context of an organization called Lefika Lapodiso, which is a non-government organization that I founded in 1996, and it's still running. And the context of the work is really one of continuous trauma. So it's based in Johannesburg. It's a context of repeating violence, but also a term that's been used specifically in the South African context is continuous trauma, which is that it's not one event or two events or multiple events that you experience and get over, but rather that it's a continuous way of being. So it's really about building ways of thinking and resilience in order to engage and manage those kinds of contexts. So here we have 94, where Mandela becomes president and really sort of leaving an apartheid era of extreme racism, splitting, degradation and authority. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was introduced in '96. And I think had extraordinary possibility and some extraordinary results, but was not conclusive. And I think what happened is that a lot was uncovered, stories were told, but yet there wasn't enough thinking about what happens after that and how does that process get metabolized, understood, and actually result in something different. So what we have is a series of presidents post-Mandela who came in with a very different sensibility. I think Mandela was extraordinary in that he came in with an idea of a humanitarian, non-racial, democratic way of being, which was very different to Thabo Mbeki coming in, and then again Zuma, and now we have Ramaphosa. But what's happened is, so in 2008, I mean, I can't go too much in it in terms of the limitation of this presentation, but there was a first wave of xenophobic violence, which the organization, the FIFA, got involved. There was a whole call for action from the different non-government sectors to say we needed to provide a service in a camp that was set up for 900 residents, and there was a spate of unimaginable violence, looting, houses being burnt, and people who had been resident and living in South Africa for, for sometimes sort of 30, 50 years, were discriminated because they came from other African countries. So sort of there was a question then about why and why now and what's being repeated and what hasn't been understood. So as an organisation, we physically were in the camps for about 6 months and offering a psychosocial service. And then in 2015 there was a second wave of violence, and it was really sort of thinking, what do we do? Do we jump back in at the coalface and offer a service, or do we have to think about what the underlying social unconscious is that's driving this kind of wave of violence again, and how do we think about it and maybe think about responding differently? And it was really about, and so much of the work in the context of violence and trauma is just reacting and responding, and it was really about how do we step back and think and not just act. So what I've spoken about is a bit about these unmetabolized layers of oppression, that in order for things to be to shift, something needs to be made meaning of. So when we talk about, if we're working in a therapeutic context and a child's been abused and that's never been addressed or thought about, it's very likely when we look at statistics that those children that have been abused become abusers, because that's their experience, that's their pattern, and when we look at it intergenerationally, it's often a pattern of, that their parents too were sort of victims of some kind of abuse. So what the work is about, certainly from a psychosocial perspective, is to start to explore sort of and name some of these patterns and atrocities in order for something different to happen. So it's beyond atonement for a white racial past. It's not just about apartheid, it's not just about colonialism, but it certainly has an impact, and it's sort of the root of a lot of it. But we need to be thinking about sort of what gets replayed and enacted because things haven't really been processed. So a lot of the rage, a lot of the humiliation, the shame, instead of owning the shame, gets projected outwards and results in a kind of violent othering. And I think that was the context of what was going on with the xenophobic violence, and certainly we can relate it in terms of Brexit, in terms of what's going on with Trump, in terms of what happens when there is a splitting and not any sort of willingness to explore one's own internal racism or one's own internal stuff that can't be thought about. So apartheid hasn't only left a deep legacy of white against black racism. The apartheid system, by forcefully ghettoizing ethnic groups, those with different shades of skin or languages, has left a legacy of not only interracial group and colour prejudice, but a prejudice against Africans from outside the country. So, there were just horrible things going on, like tests that used to happen in the apartheid era of there was in apartheid there was the pencil test to see if your hair could if your hair stayed in the pencil and didn't fall out, you were categorized as black or colored. With this wave of xenophobic violence, if you couldn't say the word elbow in Zulu and you weren't of Zulu culture, you were called other and sent off to a camp. And so it wasn't only foreign nationals, it was also people who were not Zulu speaking. So I guess what that's saying is that there have been inadequate spaces for thinking, and part of the development of the organisation, the FICA, happened post-Mandela as a way of creating spaces where people could start having democratic engagements, conversations, thinking and processing some of this unnameable trauma. So creating spaces where we can also start to see one another on a much more relational, interpersonal, intimate level. So there's something about the psychic state, which is a type of post-traumatic stress of a nation that you can't treat because it hasn't yet been diagnosed. And there is something about forgiveness being overrated and justice is underrated. And South Africa has the most extraordinary constitution, but yet are probably the worst in implementing it, which is, I think, what makes it so tragic.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about social dreaming. Some of you have heard me talk about it already. Social dreaming, in this case, I'm going to talk about it as a research method. In the context that Hayley's just explained, the problem in terms of research is how do you research something that is so traumatic that through oppression it's been repressed? How can you really understand people's emotional and emotional cognitive understandings of what has happened to them and what is happening to them in a complex situation such as the situation in South Africa? How can you understand that without understanding what's been inside them, what is repressed inside them? Because, as many of you will know, what happens with something like trauma is that that stuff does not want to be expressed, therefore it's hidden inside. So one of the problems, for example, with truth and reconciliation is precisely that if you ask conscious, cognitive questions of people in that situation, the responses will also be cognitive and rational, and the things that really matter to people will remain hidden inside. So although in theory you might hear responses that sound as if consensus has been reached, that we understand that reparation has to happen, that I forgive you for the crime that you did, the problem with that is that that might be a conscious, rational knowledge of what you need to do, almost a politically correct thing to do for those circumstances. But what really counts, what people really feel, remains hidden inside, remains repressed, remains undealt with. And then, of course, if it's not dealt with, later on, when circumstances arise, it re-emerges, as happens in South Africa. So the inner traumatic state of being humiliated, shamed, a state of danger and fear because of xenophobia arising from the white colonial South Africa before Nelson Mandela doesn't just disappear with the disappearance of the white colonial presence before Mandela, because the emotional and deep traumatic affect that has scarred people remains within. So any excuse can trigger that kind of xenophobia. So what Hayley was describing was that today you still have xenophobia, but it could be xenophobia among people of colour, people from different African nations. So social dreaming was used in this context for the same reason as it's used in other complex situations. So in terms of research, if you have a very complex situation, social dreaming is a research method of choice for those very reasons. So just briefly what it is, it's the name given to a group of people who gather together between 8, maybe 12, 15, 16 people, that kind of number of people. They gather together in a group, but it's in a special formation. I'll describe that in a minute. It's called a matrix as opposed to a group for this reason. They gather together in a group and they share their nighttime dreams, and they share their associations and their feelings to other nighttime dreams that people can have. During the course of the matrix, there's no interpretation given. There's no judgment. No one turns around and says, aha, you've had that dream because X, Y, Z. None of that. The dreams are allowed, if you like, to float in the air, and each person can make her or his own interconnections between the dreams. You end up having a collage of dreams, associations, images and feelings that develops in your own mind, and it's through the interconnections, that collage of dream images and affect, it's through that meaning emerges. So the whole meaning-making process is an emergent one, arising, as it were, as opposed to a cognitive, focused, rational one where an object is focused on. In other words, you are experiencing the knowledge as the knowledge emerges, as opposed to objectifying the knowledge and analysing it from afar. Now, the nature of the language of dreams is largely visual. Although dreams have a kind of storyline, the things that you remember are the fantastic visual images that piece together a dream. So when I've been doing this kind of work with Hayley, we've tried to bring out and emphasise the visual nature of dreams, and there is a body of literature on visual research, in order to emphasise the visual aspect of the dream work through image making and object making. So this is, if you like, a version of social dreaming, specially devised for these purposes. So this was the process. Now, as you can see, I said it's called a matrix, not a group. In the world of social dreaming, that is a critical description. Here are the people who are involved in the social dreaming matrix. The critical thing about the way they're seated is that the gaze is averted. So in a psychodynamic therapeutic group, what the tendency is for people to sit in a circle, and when you sit in a circle, you are looking at people in the eye when you speak. So I am addressing you. As I'm speaking to you now, I'm looking at people, you're looking at me, and I'm addressing people, and that is the dynamic of the interaction. But as you can see, in a matrix situation, you are discouraged from looking at someone in the eye and addressing someone in the eye. Because when you express your dream or your association or your affect, feeling, when you're doing that, you are not saying, this is my dream and I'm telling you. You're not doing that. What you're doing is you're saying, I am offering a dream to the space, if you like, of the matrix. Going back to what Hayley was referring to, the idea of creating new thinking spaces. So the space belongs to everybody. Famously, in social dreaming, people always say, we are interested in the dream, not the dreamer. So it's not about me, it's not about you, it's about the matrix, the collective. So a group of 14 community arts counsellors are seated in this way. The participants in the matrix are given resources, materials to make creative responses to aspects of the matrix that resonated with them. So this is the part that Hayley has introduced to the social dreaming process. You begin with the social dreaming as contributing your dreams in a spoken fashion. Then you create objects, images, responding to the social dreaming matrix. And then finally, the images or objects are shared in the group in a circle, as opposed to in that kind of formation. So here's an example of the image making after the social dreaming matrix. I don't know, Hayley, if you want to comment on that?
So the matrix becomes a kind of evocative objects space in a way, and the participants are invited to enter a studio space where there's a huge vocabulary of materials available, and really to sort of just translate that experience individually or in a group. So I've worked with it where we've done group images in response to a matrix, which is very interesting. Or individually, people can go off and create an image in response to the matrix of anything that kind of resonated. And what emerges from that is another whole plethora of free associations. So it kind of expands the unconscious and free associative process. Then what happens is we bring it back into the space, and that's another opportunity for free association, where people will bring an image and someone else will respond to that image, and that forms another level of matrix and a deepening understanding of what's being experienced.
So here in
and
this
again,
slide,
it's not an interpretation of the individual image, but looking at the image as a collective.
and so this slide demonstrates that final part. So the first part, expressing your dreams in the matrix. The second part, making concrete images or objects. And the third part, bringing those images or objects into the center of the room and placing the chairs around the images and using those images as a stimulus for further association to the images, which themselves have been triggered by the dream images. In terms of data, what have we got? In the first part, in the social dream matrix, the matrix is recorded and transcribed, and then here you have the actual visual images themselves. So you have data in the form of a transcription of the first part and the images themselves, or pictures of those images as well. And those two things, the transcript and the images, can be brought together in a panel analysis of researchers who would analyse those things in conjunction. So here are the findings then, a few findings. There is an enormous richness and complexity of findings in this kind of work, and we haven't got time today to go into it. There's a little bit more detail in the book chapter, but what we do want to demonstrate today is the particular nature of data that you can get from a social dream matrix. This is the key, because of course if you could get this kind of data from another method, why would you bother with social dreaming? So for example, this slide is titled Recurring Images of Blood. Now, the word recurring is important here because the nature of the social dreaming experience for participants is such that because it emerges in a kind of experiential state of becoming as part of a shared experience of participants, because it's an emergent property in that way, it's not, as we said before, it's not rational, intellectual and cognitive, therefore it's not linear either. So if you imagine a discursive quality in a text, for example, you expect that to be linear and rational. So one sentence leads to the next, and so on. So you would expect one image leading to an association, leading to another image, and so on. But in social dreaming, that's not the case. And the way I've described this is either as a collage of images or as, using a sort of Deleuzian term, a rhizomatic collection of images. They recur, but they don't necessarily happen in sequence. So you might have an image of blood, for example, at the beginning of the matrix, then it may seem apparently to die away, and then it may recur in the middle of the matrix, then it may appear to die away, and then it may recur at the end of the matrix. And one of the tricks in analysing this kind of data is to understand that just because it hasn't hit the sort of linearity, that doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. It makes sense in a rhizomatic fashion, and it's the duty of the job, if you like, of the researcher to make those links which are not explicitly made during the course of the matrix. So this is what this is. These three quotations from the transcript do not follow each other, even though I put 1, 2, 3. They're not immediately following. They are interconnected in that fashion, in that rhizomatic fashion. So let's have a look at the first one then. I had a dream of a priest from Nigeria drinking blood out of a bowl. He was looking into my eyes and saying that I need to pay for the xenophobia attacks that have been happening. And then the matrix continues. And then later on, red, white and black images of xenophobic victims with their faces chopped, with blood all over their faces. And then the matrix continues. And later on, he's so tall, this is a description of a dream, a man in a dream. He's so tall, let me just cut under his knees and just cut the things behind his knees. I started cutting them and I started to see the blood come out. He eventually kneeled down and when I looked, it was full of blood. So, in the reiterations of dreams where blood emerges as a visual image, but of course it's not just visual, because the thing about the visual image is that it's immediately, closely and intimately attached to affect, to deep emotions. So it's not a neutral thing. If I show you an image of blood, or if I say the word blood, each of you will immediately associate an affect to it. So it's a visual affect, it's an image affect. Each of these iterations of blood brings a slightly different perspective to the affect. Now, the affect associated with blood is something which is very difficult to rationally express. It's a kind of deeper horror. It's the kind of thing that you associate with gore. Look at the kind of words that appear. Chopped, with blood all over their faces. This kind of language brings out the visual and the deep affect associated with that form of violence, which in a debate, say for example in a focus group, absolutely bog standard research tool, in a focus group you would not get this kind of depth of resonating affect, understanding the deeper true meaning of what's going on in a focus group, even though it's a group and even though the research question might be the same question. Here we have an understanding of the very deep and embedded nature of what's going on in people's lives. And as soon as you understand that, you're in a realm of using affect in research in a way that you couldn't use with other research methods. And each of these resonates with the idea and feeling and the affect of the word blood. And each of them introduces a different perspective to that particular affect. So if I look, for example, at the second one, okay, if I looked at the second one out of context, it would mean much less than looking at it in the context of these three quotations here. If I look at the second one here, what you can see is the idea, the sort of rather beautiful idea, and yet a beautiful idea covered in violence and anguish. The beautiful idea that if our faces are covered in blood, it doesn't matter if you are white or black, because you are all red. And red defines us as a human being, is a defining element of the human being, and so demonstrates something about the anguish of understanding that xenophobia exists because of black and white, even though our defining quality is the red, if you like, the red of life. Link that kind of idea with the third one, for example, the idea of the dominance of that kind of relationship, which there's you can't cope with that dominance. The person is so tall, it's representative of a dominating, violent authority. The person is so tall that you can't cope with it without violence, without chopping away at the knees. And the result of chopping away is that the giant kneels in submission. So the kneeling aspect brings out the submission aspect, which has emerged from the violence, and then the idea that the chopping of the the legs has produced a pool of blood. This, in the minds of people in the Matrix, is linked right back to the idea that blood is common to all. So that the xenophobia represented in the tall man in relationship to the smaller man, it is illuminated by the result of kneeling, and yet at the same time the blood that joins the small man with the kneeling giant. How do we know? We know because we've already in the Matrix had this second iteration here before. So it gets weaved together in that kind of complexity. Now, the example, this is an image drawn by Seppo Motang in the same matrix, which demonstrates the kneeling giant here after being cut down, and here you have the pool of blood. So this is an illustration from the dreamer of that particular dream, which was created after the social dreaming matrix in the object and image making session, and then brought into the circle in the third part of that session in this kind of more concrete image. And there's an opportunity for another description of that image from the dreamer. On the ground, it was so red in the way that I could see the reflections of us down there. And what a beautiful description, which demonstrates exactly what we've been seeing in this particular slide here, actually coming from the dreamer himself. So this is really important, right? In terms of research, it's not some researcher saying, aha, I have interpreted it like that. A lot of this is coming from the mouth of the dreamer, the participant in the social dreaming matrix, because he says here, so red in the way that I could see the reflections of us down there. The reflection of us, the people, in the blood, right? So we are reflected in the blood, which is the symbol in the matrix of the way we are all interconnected as human beings beyond black and beyond white. I was so short from this guy, he was so tall. That is an expression of the xenophobic relationship. Like a giant. I could bring him down so he wanted to do something terrible to me. So this is the way this is kind of working. And you can understand, I think, viscerally, not just cognitively, and this is so important, viscerally, you can understand, and this dreamer can understand, we can understand, I can understand as a researcher, the dreamer can understand, the dreamer is not alone, the dreamer is part of a matrix of people. We can understand that there is something visceral about this traumatic understanding of xenophobia, and that visceral nature needs to be dealt with. It's not enough to say, oh, I'm sorry for my sins. It's not enough. This kind of visceral stuff needs to be dealt with.
So can I just say another thing about, so Seppo created the title for it, but also you said something about, and I just wanted to amplify, you said something about it was an illustration of the dream, but it really wasn't an illustration, it was more a visceral experience of it, which was embodied in the image. So I think there's something different about illustrating something and really allowing the material and the image to sort of take on another form of affect that is a visceral experience. So, yeah. So
that's completely the case, because that visceral, experiential feeling is the way that the knowledge is created. It's a new ontology that is lived inside the experience of the matrix. So the knowledge is an experienced knowledge as opposed to a cognitive knowledge. And that's as true of the social dreaming part one as it is of the creation of the images and the subsequent discussion of the images. I think that's what.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk a bit about the sort of the impact of even sort of in relation to you sitting there as an audience, and the impact of discussing and thinking about it in different contexts, the viscerality, if there's such a word, around sort of how it impacts and sort of one gets affected. What's after this? I think.
you want to talk about that? Go on.
No, but we were going to go back, but
Right.
we'll get back to that.
So what this demonstrates is the later echoes in the matrix, as I was describing before, that also happen in the concrete images. So you have here an image, a concrete image associated with an image that has been expressed. What gives us life? Is it that water that we want to quench our thirst? Is it blood? What is it? So the idea of blood and the visual image of blood becomes associated with water. Blood may be sometimes associated with life and sometimes with death. And the image of water associated with blood, but at the same time distinct from blood, is another image that begins to reoccur in the matrix. And it reoccurs in an accumulative fashion. It's not that we've done blood, now we're on to the water. It's not like that. The blood introduces the possibility of water, just as, for example, that's suggested by being reflected in the blood. You normally think about being reflected in the water. So water starts to be associated with blood, and of course water is associated with life and baptism, blood associated with death, and yet blood consists mostly of water, etc., etc. It starts to accumulate in that way in the social dream matrix. And here, once again, I do want to say, it is the participants who are bringing up the interpretations of these things in the first instance. As researchers, we may wish to develop those interpretations, but these things are coming from the participants. It's a really important part of this whole process. So here's further echoes, someone relating this to her ideas of religion or Christianity. People were trusting the blood of Jesus to wash away the blood of the people that were being killed, the innocent people. And that's a great example of how possibly not everyone in that matrix was religiously minded. Possibly not everyone in that matrix was a Christian. This person evidently was a Christian and a devout Christian. This person was able to participate in the image of blood in her own way. Right? That's really important. So there's a common binding together of understandings through the image, despite the cognitive differences, the cultural differences of those people's lives. So that's a great example of that. And there's an image associated with that. Here you have the cross, and from the cross you've got, if you like, streams of blood. So the important thing here is the blood that unites the cultural or religious aspect of this person's life with the life of the other people participating in the social dreaming matrix. And here is a fantastic development of the water-blood theme, which concentrates on the water aspect. And it's a rather beautiful dream. I'm going to read the whole thing to you. Before I could drink that water, there was a queue full of people of all ages. And later on, this dream explains that the queue is similar to a queue for voting in a democratic election. Now, as you can imagine, to vote in a democracy in South Africa is a big deal, considering the history of South Africa. So this is a reference to that, an oblique reference to that. Queue full of people of all ages. Some were crawling and some were walking. In other words, we're talking there about generations, yes? Walking and crawling. Some were beautifully dressed and some were in very old clothes. It doesn't matter if you're beautifully dressed or you have old clothes, because in a democracy, every vote is equal. This is what the dream is talking about, okay? But it's talking about it in the context of queuing for water, and water has emerged previously as being associated to life, death, and blood, and so on. That's the thing you have to bear in mind. It's not something spoken in isolation. It's something spoken in the context of the social dreaming matrix. And they were all asking for water from me, and I could not help but give it to them. The first person I gave to was an old lady. I gave the water to her, and she drank. I then had to open the tap again for the next person. Then for the next person, until I was finished with those people. I was thirsty, but felt I could not give to myself. I had to give to everybody that was there. And when I could see that the water was about to finish from that bucket, I thought it was unfair, because I wanted the water. Then I filled up the cup, but when the cup was right next to my mouth, when I was about to sip, an old man pulled my elbow, and the cup fell, and I could not drink the water, and the water fell on the ground. So I could not be reborn, I could not be nourished. The inadequacy of democracy, which is a struggle in South Africa, and how it feels to be deliberately have the cup taken away from your mouth, that is expressed, again, viscerally in that kind of dream. So democracy and the lack of democracy, or the difficulties in democracy, which we in a place like the UK, so far so good, we might discuss that as, what's the best way of representational democracy in the UK, blah, blah, blah. We could have a debate about it. In this kind of context, it's a visceral experience thing, and it's important to understand that. That's why templates of democracy don't necessarily work when applied in different situations, ignoring cultures, etc. So post-colonialism, colonial sins and so on are all implied in this kind of contribution.
And just to say, may come out a bit later, but specific to the xenophobic violence and resources, part of the process of inviting the community councillors together to the social dreaming matrix was to try to understand what is going on a social unconscious level that's promoting this again. It's, and part of it is about resources and the lack of resources and the competition for resources, that there's just not enough. And that's what sparked the violence the first time and the second time, around people who were incredibly resourceful, coming from other countries, setting up businesses, setting up, shops on the side of the street and actually making a living. And the envy that ensued around saying, well, they're taking our jobs. And that's really about government's failure to provide enough resources for everybody. So there's something here about resources and just not being available.
And I think that...
And the image of the jug.
Yeah, and to emphasise the nature of this data, because of course you've just said the resources are not available, the government are not providing resources, but the point of the way this is expressed is, what does that mean? It means that even when the cup of water, symbolically speaking, is right next to your mouth, is dashed away from you, the gross injustice of it is brought out in this kind of expression. So, thoughts and conclusions emanating from those findings. I think you should comment about this as you've commented before.
So I'm trying to think who said this, but it's so gruesome in parts and so painful, and the trauma is so vivid and visceral, it weaves together, feels more real than sometimes we do intellectually in a room with an individual, in a sense. Feels the blood and the guts and the gore is present. So this was a statement actually from a psychoanalyst, Mark Soames, who is very well known in the neuroscience field, but I'm part of a group that I still continue to be part of, which is an intergenerational trauma group. And I asked if I could present the material there, that we could think about it together with a group of analysts, a group of psychotherapists, and just was so much to hold that I think there is the function of, where we take our work. So as art therapy students, as art therapists, it's about the importance of supervision, of thinking spaces that we can really think together with and unpack and process. And so this was Mark's comment to say, in a way, he felt that the images themselves were the primary raw material, and the dreaming in some way was more secondary, and then the analysis or the thinking was tertiary, which was an interesting way of thinking about it, that the images were visceral and raw, and the feeling of the blood and the guts and the experience of being in that context was so felt and so shocking. But there was something so important about multiple spaces to think about it, to get to the point where we could write a chapter, where we could think about it, where it could be presented in this sort of forum to be published. Because it was just, I think, often when you're in work that is not about research out there, but research that's really about engaging in the psychosocial and trying to understand what the context is, it's sometimes very hard to think. So this is exactly what we're saying, that this ability to think, I mean, and that's what trauma does. It shatters the capacity to make sense of things, and it shatters the opportunities to breathe and mourn and think, because they're just, you know, the structures that come into play are really about defenses to try and ward off the trauma rather than engage with it. I mean, we choose to sort of not go there, but we know that when we do, we can move things from a state of frozen grief into something that's more malleable and workable. So really something like this is that we can avoid and start to engage with something not having to be repeated. Kind of in therapy we say, in a way, once you name something, there's not as much need to keep enacting that thing. So, you know, a mad example of a little girl that I'm seeing who sort of will squirt out loads of ink and throw it and whatever, and it's just like abundance, and you have to kind of keep watching it happen until something's understood. And when you can name it, in terms of maybe you're trying to show me something about the mess that's going on inside, for example, it doesn't have to be continually enacted. So it's those sorts of opportunities to have these spaces, to create them, to think them, and then also sort of make meaning of them, that allows us to move out of the repetition compulsion. And a creative thinking space, and a creative space for making, for feeling and experiencing the irrational.
So we're going to bring some questions to you about this, and here they are. Would you like to go through them, Hayley?
So I mean, it would be really good to think about it. I mean, for those of you that have experienced the matrix, for those of you that haven't, you will this year. We're going to be doing it for the first years and the third years, and we have worked with the second years. And hopefully there'll be opportunities on other levels. So for example, UH Arts is working with new geographies, and we're potentially going to offer a social dreaming matrix for just the public and people that are engaging with the artwork. So it's really to think together about what, you know, from what we've presented, sort of how this methodology can be used in an interdisciplinary kind of contemporary art practice, in the context of this research group, in the context of how it contributes to knowledge that maybe other approaches can't, and the forum for thinking about it in the process of learning and teaching. So a lot of the art therapy training, for example, is experiential, and is there room to be working in this way kind of across the different disciplines? So for example, I'm working with public health on something where we're going to be engaging in a community mapping process, and there may be room in terms of thinking about public health issues with this sort of medium, and bringing in the creative arts disciplines to collaborate. So is it a good example of research into teaching? How can students be a form of engaging with this process as participatory researchers? And is this process useful to start to think about, engage and understand the current British socio-political climate? So just be really valuable to hear your thoughts.
So that's it, but I'll put the previous one up.